You say you're lonely, but it's not the kind of loneliness that comes from an empty room. It's the kind that follows you into crowds, the kind that lingers even when someone's hand is holding yours. It shows up late at night, in between the scrolls and distraction. It creeps in when the conversation stops, and in that moment, you feel it. An ache that has no name, a silence that's louder than anything else in the room. But what if I told you you're not just lonely? You're disconnected from the only person you can never escape, yourself. And maybe that's the hardest relationship of all. Because being with others is easy to fake. You can smile, nod, pretend to be okay. But when you're alone, there's nowhere left to hide. That's when the real questions come up. The ones you've spent years trying not to hear. Who am I when no one's watching? Why do I feel like a stranger in my own skin? Why does being alone feel more like punishment than peace? No one ever taught you how to be with yourself. They taught you how to please others, how to impress, how to be valuable, by being useful, productive, agreeable, successful. But no one ever taught you how to simply sit with your soul, to witness your thoughts without judgment, to breathe with your emotions instead of pushing them away, to be present, not for others, but for you. So what happened? You learned to escape, and it worked for a while. You got really good at staying busy, always something to do, always someone to help, always a reason to keep moving. But underneath that movement, there was a silence growing, a space that couldn't be filled with noise, and when you finally stopped, that space came back. Only this time, it felt unbearable, because it wasn't just silence, it was absence. Your absence from yourself. Freud once said that people run from internal discomfort into external distraction, not because they're weak, but because facing themselves feels like staring into a void they were never prepared for. The ego, when not anchored in truth, will always seek mirrors to define itself. Validation, attention, approval. And in the absence of those things, it starts to crumble. But here's the truth your soul has been waiting to hear. You were never meant to live your life performing for the world and hiding from yourself. And yet, that's what so many of us do, especially in spiritual spaces. We call it serving. We call it being busy for the kingdom. We call it carrying the burden. But deep down, sometimes it's not ministry. It's escape, a way to avoid the emptiness we feel when we stop, a way to drown out the silence that reminds us we've forgotten how to be alone without feeling abandoned. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How you can feel abandoned while still being in your own body. But that's what happens when you never learn to love your own company, when no one taught you that your presence is enough, when being alone was always associated with rejection, punishment, or shame. Somewhere along the line, solitude turned into a trigger, and that's when the soul fractures. You see, the deepest kind of loneliness isn't when others leave you. It's when you leave, when you abandon your own thoughts, when you avoid your own emotion, when you silence your own voice because it doesn't fit into what you think God wants to hear. You start to think that solitude means failure, that if you were stronger, holier, more spiritually mature, you wouldn't feel this way. But what if it's the opposite? What if the invitation to be alone is sacred? What if the silence isn't a sign of punishment, but a path to reconnection? You don't need more noise. You don't need another sermon. You don't need a flood of content to numb the ache. You need to meet yourself again. Not the version of you that tries to be okay for everyone else. Not the spiritual profile you perform for the church or your family. But the real you. The one who's still waiting to be seen. The one who cried when they were told, "Stop being dramatic." The one who learned to be quiet to stay safe. The one who was never asked, "How do you feel?" Only told, "Have more faith." That version of you doesn't need fixing. It needs present. And you can't give that presence if you're afraid of your own silence. If the moment you're alone, you reach for your phone. If the second your chest tightens, you call it a demon instead of a signal. Because not every spiritual storm is an attack. Sometimes it's a call home. And home is not another person, not a new environment, not a new goal to chase. Home is your own heart. And you've been knocking on every door except the one inside you. That's why you feel the way you do. It's not just loneliness, it's self-abandonment disguised as emptiness. But the good news is this: you can come back, you can return, and know It won't be comfortable at first. The silence will still feel heavy. The room will still echo with question. But this time, you won't run, because now you understand. The ache you feel isn't a sign of weakness. It's a reminder that your soul is still alive and still longing to be known. And it's not too late. Not to slow down, not to be still, not to sit in that silence and hear, for the first time in years, the sound of your own spirit breathing beneath the noise. And maybe, just maybe, if you stay there long enough, you'll realize you were never truly alone. You just hadn't learned how to be with you yet. You've probably never called it fear. You just said you're not good at being still. You blamed it on personality, on needing to stay busy, on being a high-functioning adult with responsibility. But if you really sit with it, if you dare to look underneath the surface, you'll see that what you're calling routine might just be ritualized escape. Because silence is not empty. It's loaded with everything you've avoided feeling. And deep down, you know this. That's why the moment the world around you quiets down, your inner world starts to panic. That's why you reach for the phone without even realizing. That's why you play music in the background while doing nothing. That's why you scroll, check, switch apps, recheck, and you tell yourself, I'm just bored. But what if boredom is just your spirit trying to talk, and you silencing it again? There's a reason so many people fear silence. Not because it's nothing, but because it's everything. It's the place where masks fall off, where there's nothing left to prove, nothing left to fix, nothing left to hide behind. And for some, that kind of nakedness is unbearable. So we run, not with our feet, but with our focus, into news, into other people's lives, into drama that isn't ours, into endless productivity, even into religion. Yes, even faith can be a distraction when it becomes a performance instead of a connection. We've been taught that spiritual busyness equals intimacy with God, that the more active you are in your church, the more surrendered you must be. But sometimes, we're not surrendering to God. We're surrendering to fear of being alone with ourselves, fear of letting the silence strip us of our role, our image, our control. It's a subtle form of spiritual bypassing, and it's so common that we rarely question it. We say, I'm just pouring out for others, but are you sure you're not just avoiding your own need to be poured into? We say, I serve because I love God, but do you believe He'd love you the same if you stopped serving for a while? We say, I feel best when I'm helping, but is your worth dependent on being needed? These questions aren't accusation, they're invitation to ask yourself gently, what am I afraid I'll find in the silence? Because the silence isn't your enemy, it's your teacher. And it will keep knocking until you answer, until you stop dressing up your pain in spiritual language, until you stop calling burnout obedience, until you stop mistaking movement for growth. And let's be honest, sometimes we don't want to stop moving because we know the moment we do, the truth will rise to the surface, that we're tired, that we're lonely, that we're afraid to be seen without our usefulness, that we haven't actually sat with God in months. We've just been working near Him. There's a reason Jesus said to go into your room, close the door, and pray. It wasn't just about privacy. It was about presence. It was about removing the eyes of others so that, finally, you could face the eyes of God. And maybe even more terrifying, your own. Because when all the layers fall away, when there are no more songs to sing, no more scriptures to post, no more encouragements to give, what's left? Just you, raw, unfiltered, real. And that's where the healing begins. But you can't heal if you don't hear, and you can't hear if you never stop, if you never rest, if you never make room for quiet. So here's the challenge that will shake your soul. What if you sat in silence for 10 minutes a day with no agenda, no prayer list, no goals, no spiritual performance, just you, God, and the honesty that rises? It will feel uncomfortable at first. You'll itch to grab your phone. You'll remember errands, messages, tasks. You'll hear that voice that says, this is a waste of time. That's not your spirit talking. That's your ego, afraid of losing control. Because in silence, control dies. But in its place, clarity is born. It's in silence that God whispers what you can't hear in noise. It's in stillness that your soul realigns with its original design, not to impress, not to hustle, but to be. And once you taste that stillness, not just as a moment, but as a way of living, you'll wonder how you survived without it. Because it won't just be about slowing down your schedule, it will be about recovering your center, the place where peace doesn't depend on productivity, where love isn't earned, where worth isn't negotiated. But to get there, you'll have to walk through the noise. You'll have to resist the urge to distract yourself every time you feel discomfort. You'll have to unlearn the reflex of doing to escape being. It's not easy, but neither is the alternative. Staying busy forever and never being home. Home in your heart, home in your presence, home in the quiet where healing breathes. And if you stay long enough in that sacred silence, something surprising starts to happen. You begin to hear a different voice, not the one that criticizes, not the one that says you're not enough, but the one that's been waiting patiently underneath all the noise. The voice that says, "I've missed you." The voice that says, "You don't have to perform." The voice that says, "This is where I meet, not in your hustle, but in your stillness." And suddenly, silence isn't scary anymore. It's sacred, it's safety, it's home. Sometimes what we call peace is just the temporary relief of not having to feel, not having to confront the aching, pulsing undercurrent we've learned to silence with effort. We wear our roles like armor, dutiful, helpful, strong. But inside, there's an exhaustion that no one sees, because from the outside, we look spiritual, steady, in control. But internally, something has gone numb. We don't cry anymore. Not because we're healed, but because we're disconnected. And we've gotten really good at calling that disconnection faith. I'm fine because I'm still showing up. I'm okay because I haven't fallen. I must be strong because I'm still serving. But what if you're not actually okay, just obediently absent from yourself? It's a hard truth, but some people feel more valuable when they're useful than when they're honest. And it's not their fault, it's survival. Somewhere along the way, you were taught that value comes from what you give, not from who you are. So you learned to stay in motion. You learned to be productive. You learned to perform peace, even if it cost you your soul. And that's when spirituality becomes anesthesia. You still show up to pray, but the prayers are rehearsed. You still listen to sermons, but your heart is cold. You say all the right things, but none of them reach you. You've confused numbness for maturity. You've called burnout sacrifice. You've accepted emotional paralysis as discipline. And the scariest part? People applaud it. They say, "Look how strong she is. Look how faithful he's been. Look how committed they are to the mission." No one sees that you haven't been home in your own body for months, but God sees. And more importantly, you see, even if you don't want to admit it, even if it scares you to say out loud, because here's the truth, no one wants to confess. Sometimes we'd rather be applauded than healed. Sometimes we'd rather be respected than known. Sometimes we'd rather be seen as reliable than risk being vulnerable. And it's not that you're lying, it's that you're surviving. You're surviving a world that told you peace means silence, that faith means hiding your feeling, that strength means never trembling. But what if real peace isn't the absence of feeling, the fullness of being? What if peace doesn't mean you don't cry? It means you don't have to cry alone. What if maturity isn't being unshaken? It's being able to hold your pain without shame. The world, and often religion, teaches us to fear our fragility, but Jesus never did. He wept, he retreated, he rested, he felt, not to prove a point, but because he was fully human, just like you. And if he didn't deny his sadness, why do you? You weren't designed to live on autopilot. You weren't created to exist in survival mode. You were built for present, for depth, for real peace, the kind that isn't polished for performance. But to get to that kind of peace, you'll have to stop pretending. You'll have to stop pretending that being busy means being blessed. You'll have to stop pretending that being quiet means being strong. You'll have to stop pretending that showing up means you're okay. Because the truth is, you can be completely functional and still spiritually fractured. You can look whole and still be hiding. You can lead others to water and still be dying of thirst. And it's not your fault. You were just never given permission to be fully human in the presence of God. You were taught to be useful before being honest, but your honesty is the doorway to your healing, not your service, not your achievement, not your ability to hold it all together. Your healing starts the moment you say, "I'm tired. I don't feel God right now. I've been showing up for everyone except myself." That's not rebellion. That's not weakness. That's your soul finally speaking. And when your soul speaks, it doesn't need a podium. It doesn't need applause. It just needs a safe place to be heard. Let that place be you. Let yourself be the sanctuary you've been building for everyone else. Let your own presence become the altar where honesty meets grace. Let your truth be the offering. Because the kind of peace your soul is starving for, it doesn't come from performance. It doesn't come from pretending. It comes from presence, real presence, sacred, soft, unapologetic presence. And once you taste it, you won't need to be needed to feel loved. You won't need to be seen to feel worthy. You won't need to be busy to feel safe. You'll simply be enough, because you'll finally be home. You weren't always afraid of being alone. That fear was planted, slowly, quietly, sometimes before you even knew how to name it. Because long before you feared being abandoned by others, you were abandoned by something inside yourself. That moment when you cried and no one came. That time when you asked for help and were told to be strong. That season when your silence was more accepted than your truth. You didn't stop reaching out because you didn't want connection. You stopped because connection started to cost too much. As children, we're wired to seek emotional presence, a mother's gaze, a father's attention, the warm echo of, "I see you." But when those needs aren't met, something splits inside. We learn to stop asking. We learn to self-soothe by disconnecting from what we feel. We mistake invisibility for safety. And later, when we grow up, that fracture follows us into adulthood, not as memory, but as behavior. So now, when you're alone, you don't feel peaceful. You feel abandoned, even though there's no one there to hurt you anymore. The old wound reawakens because your body remembers what your mind tried to forget. And that's the dangerous illusion of adulthood. We think our current emotions come from the present moment, but many of them are echoes. Echoes of a voice that once told you, "You're too much," or worse, "You don't matter." So when the room goes quiet, it's not just silence that scares you. It's the ghost of not being seen. You scroll your phone, you turn on the TV, you look for someone to talk to, not because you're weak, but because being alone with yourself feels like being trapped in a room with someone you don't know anymore. And that's the heartbreak no one talks about. Because it's one thing to miss another person. It's another thing to realize you've been missing yourself. So many of us have spent years building an identity that other people approve of, without ever asking, "Is this who I really am?" We learned to adapt so well that we started mistaking adaptation for authenticity. We confused acceptance with love. We confused being chosen with being known. And every time we chose external validation over internal truth, we drifted further away from ourselves. That's why solitude hurts. Not because we're truly alone, but because we've lost our ability to feel safe in our own presence. But here's the part that breaks the cycle. You don't have to perform to be worthy. You don't have to prove anything to be loved. You don't have to be perfect to come back home to yourself. And maybe, just maybe, this ache you feel isn't a curse. Maybe it's a calling, a sacred invitation to stop chasing the next distraction and finally turn inward, not to fix yourself, not to judge yourself, but to sit with yourself the way no one else ever did, like the parent you never had, like the friend you always needed, like the God you've been seeking in every room but your own. Because God doesn't only meet you in the church or the crowd. Sometimes He waits for you in the echo of your loneliness, not to punish you, but to walk you back to yourself. But first, you have to stop running. Running from the discomfort, running from the silence, running from the version of you that still carries the unspoken pain of childhood. You have to pause long enough to hear your own soul whisper, "I'm still here. I never stopped hoping you'd come back. I just didn't know how to ask for you." And in that moment, you begin to realize the truth. You weren't made to fill every room with noise. You weren't made to bury every emotion in spiritual language. You weren't made to chase after love that demands your disappearance. You were made to be whole, to be known, to be seen, first by you. Because once you begin to befriend the parts of you that were once rejected, the loneliness starts to dissolve. Not because someone filled the space, but because you stopped abandoning yourself. And when that happens, something shifts. You no longer fear the silence. You crave it. You no longer need others to define your worth. You remember it. You no longer mistake solitude for rejection. You receive it as rest. And slowly, the soul that once trembled in isolation begins to stand taller. Not because the pain is gone, but because now it has a witness, a listener, a guardian, you. You don't have to be afraid of yourself anymore. There's a version of you waiting in the silence, not to punish you, not to haunt you, but to heal you. Not the voice of shame that repeats what others once said, but the quiet presence of your soul, whispering things you were never told. You are safe now. You're allowed to be here. You're allowed to feel. You're allowed to stop hiding. Healing doesn't begin with a miracle. It begins with permission. Permission to sit still. Permission to no longer explain your pain to people who never understood it. Permission to stop performing, even in prayer. Because sometimes the most sacred moment in your life is when you stop talking and start listening. Not to the world, not even to a sermon, but to that fragile, beautiful, trembling voice inside of you that's been waiting to be heard for years. The one you silenced every time you said, "I'm fine." The one you ignored every time you chose busyness over honesty. The one you buried under spiritual cliches because you thought faith meant never feeling broken. But what if it doesn't work like that? What if the moment you stop pretending you're okay is the moment God actually meets you? What if your weakness is not a barrier, but the very doorway to your restoration? Because real healing doesn't come when you finally become strong. It comes when you finally stop running from your weakness. When you let the tears fall without apologizing for them. When you stop rebuking your emotions and start honoring them as part of your humanity. Think about this. Jesus wept. Let that sink in. The Son of God, fully divine. And yet, he cried. He didn't repress. He didn't numb. He didn't hide. He felt, fully, publicly, freely. And yet here we are, thinking that the more spiritually mature we become, the less human we're allowed to be. You don't need to rebuke your sadness. You need to sit with it. You don't need to cast out your grief. You need to bless it for showing you what mattered. You don't need to pray away your emotions. You need to pray with them, honestly, vulnerably, desperately. That's not a lack of faith. That's true faith. Because true faith doesn't bypass the valley. It walks through it. True faith doesn't require a mask. It invites surrender. True faith isn't loud. Sometimes it's just stillness. And in that stillness, something happens. Your nervous system begins to calm. Your breath starts to deepen. Your heart starts to trust again. Not because everything is perfect, but because you're no longer abandoning yourself to survive the moment. You're beginning to live it, feel it, inhabit it. And that's the beginning of peace. Not the kind that looks good on social media. Not the kind that impresses religious communities, but the kind that doesn't need an audience. The kind that meets you in your pajamas on a Tuesday night, when your phone is off and your thoughts are loud, and yet, for the first time in a long time, you don't feel afraid of them. You sit, you breathe, you listen, and maybe you light a candle, or take a slow walk, or speak a single sentence to God that feels raw but real. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm here. That's enough. That's always been enough. Because the peace you've been searching for, in people, in approval, in constant activity, was never out there. It was always waiting for you in one place, your presence. And more than that, His presence, with you, inside you, even in the places you thought were too dark to be holy. So now, when the silence returns, it doesn't feel like punishment. It feels like invitation, an open door back to yourself, back to God, back to wholeness. And the loneliness that once haunted you, it starts to feel like rest because you've stopped needing someone else to sit with you. You've learned how to sit with yourself, and in doing so, you've finally come home.